It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Between 1971 and 1974, there were several reports from the Texarkana area of southern Arkansas of a large ape-like creature that walked on two legs and had long, dark hair, spotted not just in the general region of Texarkana, which is the kind of the southwesternmost part of Arkansas, but also around Fouke, Arkansas. And this cryptid would mostly become known as the Fouke monster, but also Boggy Creek monster, the Swamp Stalker, and the Jonesville monster. The earliest reports inspired the movie that we're going to be talking about this week, The Legend of Boggy Creek. This little indie docudrama was, in fact, no real small movie. It turned out to gross just outside the top 10 for 1972 as a whole. The filmmaker who would make this film was Charles B. Pierce. Largely, Pierce was a set decorator. He'd set scenes, basically. This was his first film he directed and produced, and this was the first of two fairly significant films that he would direct in the 70s. The other would be another Texarkana legend about a series of murders that were ultimately never solved now 80 years on as of the recording of this episode. That movie was called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. That movie always had a striking poster / videotape cover because it was an image of a man who wore a cloth sack over his head, like the first time that we saw Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th Part 2. But Pierce would work on a lot of pretty interesting films like blaxploitation classics Coffee and Black Belt Jones. That's what he did some of his set decoration on. Also, he did set decoration for 1973's Dillinger, which was the directorial debut of John Milius. But he also worked on a lot of popular TV shows like The Twilight Zone. And later, he became friends with Clint Eastwood after moving to Eastwood's home of Carmel, California, where they developed a treatment that Pierce had that would later become the Dirty Harry sequel, Sudden Impact. Now, when it comes to The Legend of Boggy Creek, this would be a highly influential film. When Daniel Myrick worked on 1999's The Blair Witch Project, he cited this film as a major influence. And naturally, any modern documentary or even mildly dramatic documentary about cryptids can really kind of point back to Pierce's work here in this movie. A sequel in 1977 that Pierce had no involvement with was released called Return to Boggy Creek, and was a pretty much straight dramatized tale about a mother and three kids who get lost in the swamp and gets a little bit of help from the creature. 8 years after that, Boggy Creek 2 and The Legend Continues served as Pierce's return to the swampy bogs of Arkansas. And that movie became famous for maybe not the greatest of reasons, as it would be featured on a late season episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000. In 2010 and 2011, two more movies using Boggy Creek followed, but none have any connection to either of Pierce's films, nor do they have anything that would stand out from what Pierce did as well. The legacy of Boggy Creek, the 2011 film, was certainly inspired by this original. So let's talk about what goes on in this movie, because this is a really interesting type of movie, and it's a movie that is not going to appeal to everyone because it does take its subject matter seriously, and this is presented as something of a documentary or a docudrama. It mixes the retelling of certain reports of the Fouke monster in with some actual interviews with the real people, because that's the first thing we see. It tells us that it's a true story, that sometimes people are playing themselves or a version of themselves, maybe slightly changing their name or something like that. and supposedly telling their actual story. And there was some concern over the handling of these people's actual testimonies. My guess is that they were twisted a little bit to make it fit the narrative that this creature does indeed exist in the bogs and creeks of Texarkana. But, that's kind of not an uncommon thing. But one of the things, and like I said, the reason why it may not necessarily be one of those movies for everyone is that it takes itself overly serious to the point where at times it doesn't feel scripted. At other times it feels like there's not a whole lot really going on, other than it seems like you're almost following these two families as they are dealing with an attack of the creature. So that's where you see a lot of that influence that would be baked into things like the Blair Witch Project, things that feel a little bit more realistic than anything else. But the movie begins with this small child running to this kind of general store / diner after his mother told him to fetch this old man to help him with this to help them with this hair-covered creature. And the old man is dubious of the claim. And after the kid leaves, he tells others at the hangout that this is the third time recently that the woman sent her son to tell him about seeing some sort of a hairy creature. And the narrator, who is the adult version of this little boy, basically tells of a time when he was 7 years old and the first time he heard the thing scream in the woods and how it scared him then as it does now. We then get introduced to this very, very small town of Fouke, Arkansas. There are only a few buildings and about 350 people, and that population had been relatively steady and static decade over decade at this point of the 20th century. The locals mostly are farmers, and in their free time they fish and sit around and talk about stuff with their neighbors and other people that live in this little town. The Crabtree family is one of the focal people of the story, and the Crabtrees are effectively trappers, and they live by by the bottoms where this creek runs through. Now, generally speaking, Fouke is a right fine place to live, as until the sun goes down, and that's when locals talk about some sort of creature that comes out of the wilderness and kind of begins to torture the local animals. Dogs bark at it, pigs and other livestock are slaughtered by it, and in particular, a pig farmer says that something took off with a 200-pound hog, and it didn't indicate that there was anything that was helping this thing carry this hog off, like tracks to a truck or some sort of equipment that would have been able to lift the hog more easily. Now, once reports of this creature started popping up in the local papers, earning the name of the Fouke Monster, some, including Fred Crabtree himself, didn't seem to think the creature was all that shy around people. It was almost like it had its territory, and if you entered into that area, you were going to see it. And it, wasn't going to really hide from you. And when Fred ran into the creature, he had a chance to shoot it, but was afraid it might have been some sort of a wild man, and he didn't want to have to live with the idea that he potentially killed somebody. But whatever it was, it seemed to be visiting Boggy Creek to wash his or its feet. Now, another Crabtree, this time Fred's uncle James, also saw the creature, and the two kind of studied each other until the creature just kind of moved on and eventually disappeared into the wooded area. Now, a more scary encounter with the creature was experienced by the women of the Searcy family. The patriarch of the family was out of town working, which he would tend to do on long stretches, leaving them alone in their remote house. Their closest neighbor was about a mile away. Now, the creature was spotted by the teenager of the family, Mary Beth, and the vision of what she saw kicked off a whole night of terror for the Searcy girls, and the next morning they even found their kitten dead. And it said that apparently the kitten was not marked in any way to indicate how it died, that maybe it was just simply scared to death. Now, after another local kid spotted the creature, this leads to a search of the woods around the creek, but the people who bring their dogs, those dogs ultimately refuse to go into the woods out of fear. However, without finding the creature, it's assumed that it retreated deeper into the wilderness after the local kid possibly shot it and harmed it to avoid, so that the creature would avoid any further interaction with people and potentially, risk greater harm. But the youngest Crabtree, Travis, returns to the bottoms to fish and trap beaver once reports of the creature start to die down. And he visits an old hermit who lives out in the bottoms. And he says that he was there for 20 years, but says that he's never seen or heard the monster. And while it seems other older farmers also say that now they do hear some strange things, but they still have never seen anything that indicates that there's some sort of a creature around the area. But reports start to come back in from residents, once again, of Fouke. And in fact, strange 3-toed footprints are also found near farms. And after some schoolgirls are terrorized by the creature's new, more aggressive incursions into people's property leads to a question about why its patterns may have suddenly changed. And the only likely answer that our narrator gives is that it's a one-of-a-kind creature and therefore just lonely. Now, the final 30 minutes really kind of focuses on one specific story, and it dramatizes the story that's reported to the papers that inspired this film. So there are two young couples, and they both have small children. They rent a house together to save some money, and it says that, the women would ultimately be each other's company while the men would work typically late into the evening. But on only the third or fourth day after moving into the house, and one of those nights in which the men were working late, the women had an encounter with the creature while it poked around the front porch and even potentially attempted to get inside by turning the front door knob. But on another day, more footprints are found near the creek where one of the men and a kid are fishing. I think the kid is either his son or maybe his nephew. It's not exactly easily figured out. But later, the creature stalks around the house once again. And just as it seems as though the creature is left and the families start to calm down and they prepare to go back to bed again, the creature reaches into the window and tries grabbing at one of the guys and his wife. And this leads to basically having to defend the house while the creature tries to get in to get to them. And they ultimately chase the creature out to the edge of the property where the wood line is, and they fire to ward off the creature. They went and got shotguns from the landlord and to basically defend their home. And when they fired, they're not entirely sure what happens. They think that they may be wounded the creature, but it just kind of disappears into the night. And when they are trying to investigate it, the creature ends up hurting one of the guys of the families. And when they rush off to talk to the local constable about, maybe getting some search together or find out what it was that was kind of stalking around the house, ultimately the guy is rushed to the hospital where he's treated for the wounds. It's then said that the creature was never caught or killed and is presumed to still be roaming the woods along Boggy Creek. But it's time for me to talk about three things I like about the Legend of Boggy Creek. First, I really like how the subject is kind of handled. Is it manipulative? Yeah. I mean, probably more than a little bit. Is it a true documentary of something that might actually live in the boondocks of Arkansas? Probably not. And yes, the last 30 minutes there is a change. There's an odd change and shift in the way that the movie handles it. It goes from the more documentary style of trying to interview people about the creature into just dramatizing the main event that led to the inspiration of this movie being filmed. But still, I mean, there are two things I like about stuff like this. First, I think it's safe to say that some of the stories about the Fouke monster or any other cryptid are accounts of unexplained sightings that these people know they saw something that their eyes maybe couldn't quite reconcile with their brains. You know, it's a combination of catching the sight of something that maybe they don't quite get fully, or they don't understand what they saw. Maybe it's just a flash of something they saw in their periphery. And it's also, combined with local folklore of the creature for the past several decades. It's what a good cryptid movie or folklore story about local creatures and legends. That's what they should do. The veracity of the accounts aren't quite as important as what it might mean to the area that they live in. And while I don't really believe any actual cryptids exist, I love that it basically makes up modern folklore. This is not much different than how Eastern Europeans would later after kind of living in their areas and settling into their areas for as long as they did, would ultimately come up with things like werewolves and vampires. I mean, it's something kind of important to particular areas of the world. And I find that more interesting than the actual creatures themselves. Next, this feels so much like the precursor to something that would come along later that I find at times quite entertaining to watch. That's the types of shows that are now on like the Travel Channel, where people talk about their various hauntings or bizarre footage they caught with their phone's cameras or whatever. But more directly, this reminds me of the various docudramas that would come later in the 70s. In particular, I can see this as being a direct precursor to the series In Search Of that was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. That talked about all sorts of strange and peculiar topics like Bigfoot or aliens or ghosts or even stranger things like ESP and the like. I loved watching that show when it would play on reruns when I was a kid. But again, not something that led me to really believe any of this stuff, but sometimes the stuff featured was maybe a little spooky and certainly was imaginative. Other docudramas that were often reviled by critics were the movies like In Search of Historical Jesus or The Lincoln Conspiracy, or even a personal favorite of mine, The Man Who Saw Tomorrow. These all purported to present real facts, but was mostly sensationalized or cherry-picked information, and that cherry-picked information was working backwards from the filmmakers' conclusions or what they were trying to sell, so that they would have the supposed facts ultimately help support the predetermined conclusion. So these are not always all that great, but they tend to provide some entertainment by presenting a potentially compelling evidence or perspective into something potentially otherworldly or of great unlikely nature. And this is similar, but as I said earlier, it does take it somewhat seriously. It is really wanting to talk about this phenomenon in this specific spot in a very specific state within the United States. And third, I can't help but to really love how this movie looks. I mean, I think it's partly the Arkansas wilderness that is presented in a way that makes it look remote and full of potential secrets. But the other thing about this movie's look is that I watched it on an old DVD, and that looks not much better or more updated from its TV or VHS release. In some ways, it looked like something that I would have watched in elementary or middle school. It feels old and somewhat simple, and that lack of definition feels much more quaint, like the area of Arkansas that this takes place in. And so it just reminds me of something that a teacher would have put on for the last day before Christmas or spring break or something. I mean, I guess it's fuzzy definition on this DVD that I watched just kind of maybe brought back some fuzzy memories or something. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com, but don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload the stuff to YouTube, so you can catch it there. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, it's another hairy creature from the 70s. And no, I'm not talking about yours truly. I'm going to talk about Trog instead. So until next week, stay spooky.